You may not know what happened yet. You may not have heard the words that were spoken, the argument that unfolded, or the confession that was almost made. But imagine, for a moment, that behind the silence you have been experiencing, something has been moving, someone has been struggling with a truth they have not known how to reveal. Someone has been caught between what they have shown the world and what they have privately carried in their heart, and last night, the pressure became too much, the third party lost control. The conversation that had been avoided finally happened. The questions that had been pushed aside finally surfaced. The excuses became harder to maintain. What had been hidden behind vague answers? Delayed conversations and uncomfortable silence suddenly stood in the middle of the room like a truth that could no longer be ignored. And the most unexpected part, it may not be the fact that this person has a marriage or complicated commitment in their life. That is only the beginning of the revelation. There is something deeper underneath it. Something about why they kept you at a distance. Something about what they have been afraid to admit. Something about the decision they have been trying desperately to postpone. Before you go any further, remember that this is a spiritual-style fictional message for reflection, not a factual prediction about a real person. If parts of this story resonate with your circumstances, use them as an invitation to think about honesty, boundaries, and the truth you deserve. Now take a breath, because last night, the silence finally broke. The third party had been holding everything inside for longer than anyone realized. At first, they tried to remain calm. They tried to act as though nothing was wrong. They asked ordinary questions. They made ordinary comments. They pretended they were not watching every reaction, but there was tension underneath every word. They knew something was different. They could feel the emotional distance. They could sense that the person they were speaking to was somewhere else mentally, even while standing directly in front of them. And eventually, they could not take it anymore. The question came out sharper than intended. You're hiding something from me, aren't you? For a moment, there was silence, not the comfortable kind, the kind of silence that answers a question before anyone says another word. The person you have been thinking about did not immediately respond, and that hesitation made everything worse, because sometimes silence says more than a confession. The third party watched their face carefully. They were looking for an explanation. They were looking for reassurance. They were looking for anything that could restore the version of reality they had been trying to believe, but instead, they saw uncertainty, and that was when the argument truly began. You keep telling me everything is fine, the third party said, but everything doesn't feel fine. Still, there was no immediate answer. The person you associate with this story looked away. Perhaps they had rehearsed this moment many times. Perhaps they had imagined telling the truth in a calm conversation, somewhere private, with carefully chosen words. But real life rarely gives people the perfect moment. Truth has a way of arriving when emotions are already overflowing, and last night, the truth was standing at the door. The third party pushed again. Is there someone else? That question changed the entire atmosphere. Because there was a difference between suspicion and confirmation, A person can dismiss suspicion, they can laugh, they can change the subject, they can say someone is imagining things, but when a person becomes quiet, when their expression changes, when their confidence disappears, the person asking the question notices, the third party noticed, and suddenly, the conversation was no longer about a small disagreement. It became about everything that had been left unsaid. The third party wanted to know who had been occupying their thoughts, who had changed their behavior, who had made them emotionally unavailable, who had caused them to stare at their phone without sending a message, who had become the subject of private thoughts they refused to explain. And then came the sentence that changed everything: "You're still thinking about them." Not a question, a statement, and perhaps that was the moment the person finally realized there was no way to keep pretending, because the truth was not simply that another person existed, the truth was that an emotional conflict had been growing inside them. They had been trying to separate responsibility from desire, appearance from reality, obligation from emotion, and you were somewhere in the middle of that conflict. But there was another layer. The third party believed they understood the situation. They thought they knew what the biggest secret was. They thought the secret was another person. They thought the answer would be simple, but what they discovered was much more complicated, because the person you associate with this message may have been carrying a marriage or serious commitment that they had not properly explained, and that revelation would be painful enough on its own, yet the marriage was not necessarily the deepest secret. The deeper secret was why they had been hiding the truth. Was it fear? Was it shame? Was it confusion? Was it an inability to make a difficult decision? Was it the desire to protect their public image? Or was it because admitting the truth would force them to confront feelings they had been avoiding? Those questions matter, because a confession is not automatically an apology. A confession is not automatically a promise, and a confession does not erase the consequences of deception. If someone has hidden something significant from you, you deserve clarity rather than excuses. You deserve honesty rather than emotional games. And that is why the most powerful part of this story is not the dramatic secret. It is the moment when the truth becomes impossible to avoid. Imagine the conversation continuing. The third party asks, "Are you married?" The room becomes completely still. There is no clever answer left, no distraction, no easy escape. Finally, the person admits it. Yes, one word. But one word capable of changing the entire meaning of everything that came before it. The third party is stunned. They had suspected something. But suspicion and confirmation are different experiences. They ask why. Why did you never tell me? Why did I have to discover this through an argument? Why did you let me believe everything was normal? Why did you keep speaking as though the future were simple? And the person has no answer that can make the situation painless. Maybe they say they were afraid. Maybe they say the marriage was complicated. Maybe they insist that the relationship had been emotionally over for a long time. Maybe they claim they were preparing to make changes. But none of those explanations can change one simple fact: the truth was hidden, and hidden truth creates consequences. The third party becomes emotional, not because every accusation they make is necessarily correct, but because they suddenly realized that the story they believed in had missing pages. They ask about you. They want to know how long you have known. They want to know what you mean to this person. They want to know whether you are the reason the relationship has become unstable. And here is where the story becomes more complicated, because perhaps you were never trying to become involved in anyone else's relationship. Perhaps you never asked for secrecy. Perhaps you never wanted to compete. Perhaps you simply became important to someone who had not resolved their own life. That distinction matters. You are not responsible for decisions another person makes. You cannot carry the weight of another person's dishonesty. You cannot be expected to repair a situation you did not create, and you should never have to accept confusion as proof of love. The third party may have lost control because they felt threatened. But fear can make people say things they later regret. Fear can turn questions into accusations. Fear can make someone believe that if they can eliminate another person, everything will return to normal. But people are not problems to be removed. Relationships cannot be repaired by controlling another person's choices. And secrets cannot create genuine security. The argument continues. You've been thinking about them this whole time. The person remains quiet. Then comes the question, do you love them? That question is different, because now the issue is no longer the existence of another person. It is the emotional truth. The person looks down. Perhaps they do not say yes. Perhaps they do not say no. Perhaps they simply admit something smaller but more revealing. I don't know what to do. And sometimes that sentence tells you more than a dramatic declaration. It reveals conflict. It reveals avoidance. It reveals that someone may have reached a point where every available choice carries consequences. The third party wants certainty. The person cannot provide it. And that is when another secret begins to emerge. They have not simply been confused about you. They have been confused about themselves. They have been living one version of their life while imagining another. They have been maintaining appearances while privately questioning whether those appearances still represent who they are. They have been afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of judgment, afraid of consequences. Afraid of admitting that decisions made years ago may no longer fit the person they have become, and perhaps most importantly, afraid of telling you the truth because they know you deserve a choice. That is the part they may never have wanted to admit. If you knew everything, would you still stay? If you knew about the marriage, would you walk away? If you knew about the confusion, would you trust them? If you knew how long they had been struggling, would you see them differently? Those questions can keep someone awake at night. And perhaps last night, one of those questions finally became unavoidable. The third party says something that makes the person freeze. You don't look at me the way you used to. There it is, the real wound, not the marriage, not even you. The realization that something inside the relationship has changed. A person can hide information. They can hide messages. They can hide conversations. They can hide explanations. But emotional distance is difficult to disguise forever. Someone who is emotionally present behaves differently from someone who is mentally somewhere else. And perhaps the third party had been noticing those differences for weeks or months, the pauses, the distracted moments, the sudden silence, the unexplained changes in routine. The way the person's expression changed whenever your name appeared. Again, this is not proof of any particular real-life event, but within this spiritual style story, these details represent something deeper, the way unresolved truth eventually becomes visible through behavior. The third party asks one final question: if you had the courage, what would you tell them? The person does not answer immediately, and then, quietly, they say something that changes the conversation. I would tell them the truth. The third party asks, what truth? The person takes a breath. I should have told them everything from the beginning. That admission carries more weight than any romantic promise, because honesty is where real change begins. Not destiny, not signs, not dramatic predictions, honesty. And perhaps this is the message you most need to hear. Do not allow the mystery surrounding another person's behavior to become the foundation of your emotional life. If someone wants a place in your future, they should be willing to bring clarity into your present. If someone claims to care about you, their actions should eventually support their words. If someone has a complicated situation, they have a responsibility to handle it honestly. You deserve the truth, not because you are entitled to control someone else's life, but because your own life deserves to be built on information you can trust. The argument last night may have exposed something important. The third party may have thought they were fighting about you, but underneath that fight was something larger. They were fighting against uncertainty. They were fighting against the feeling that they no longer knew the person standing in front of them. And the person was fighting against their own fear, fear of consequences, fear of change, fear of admitting that pretending everything was fine had become impossible, and somewhere in the middle of all that was the truth they had been avoiding: the marriage, the feelings, the uncertainty, the need for a decision. But there is still another secret. This is the part that may surprise you most. The biggest secret may not be that they are married. It may be that they have already begun to understand what their dishonesty has cost them. They may have realized that secrecy does not protect love, it damages trust. They may have realized that postponing difficult conversations does not make problems disappear. It gives those problems time to grow. They may have realized that if they truly care about someone, they cannot keep that person trapped inside a story they refuse to explain, and perhaps that realization is why last night's argument became so intense. The third party wanted reassurance, but reassurance could not repair what truth had already broken. The person wanted more time, but time was no longer solving the problem. You may wonder what happens next. The honest answer is that nobody can know for certain. A dramatic spiritual message should never be treated as guaranteed knowledge of another person's private thoughts or future actions. What can be known is what you choose. You can choose clarity, you can choose boundaries, you can choose not to chase explanations from someone unwilling to provide them, you can choose to let actions speak louder than promises. You can choose not to compete with a third party. You can choose not to participate in secrecy. And if someone eventually comes forward with the truth, you can decide what that truth means for you. You do not have to make a decision simply because someone else finally decided to confess. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to say, I need time, you are allowed to say, I cannot accept this. You are allowed to walk away, and you are allowed to recognize that love without honesty is not enough. Perhaps that is the deeper transformation hidden inside this story. At first, the focus seems to be on your soulmate. What did they do? What did they say? Who did they argue with? What secret are they hiding? What will they confess? But eventually, the focus turns back toward you. What do you need? What do you believe? What kind of relationship do you want? What does respect look like to you? What boundaries protect your peace? Those questions are more powerful than any prediction, because the future is not something another person's secret gets to control. You have a voice in your own future. You have choices, you have standards, and you have the right to wait for circumstances that are honest and healthy. Imagine now that the argument has ended, the third party has left the room or gone quiet, the person sits alone. For the first time, there is no one to blame, no argument to hide behind, no accusation to answer, no distraction, only silence. And in that silence, they think about you, not as an idealized fantasy, not as someone they can simply call whenever they feel lonely, but as a real person who deserves to know the truth. They realize that if they ever speak to you, they cannot give you half-truths. They cannot say only the parts that make them look good. They cannot hide the marriage and expect you to understand everything else. They have to tell the whole story. And that may be the confession that truly matters. I should have been honest. Not, you're my destiny. Not, I can't live without you. Not, everything will magically work out. Just, I should have been honest. That sentence may sound less romantic than a grand declaration, but it is far more meaningful, because honesty creates the possibility of informed choice. And informed choice creates freedom. Perhaps the person eventually reaches out. Perhaps they explain, perhaps they apologize, perhaps they finally reveal the circumstances surrounding their marriage, perhaps they tell you that they were afraid you would leave if you knew everything. If that happens, remember this. Their fear may explain their behavior. It does not automatically excuse it. Understanding someone does not require surrendering your boundaries. You can have compassion and still say no. You can care and still step back. You can forgive and still decide that trust must be rebuilt slowly. You can listen without promising anything. That is strength. And perhaps this entire message is less about waiting for a soulmate and more about becoming strong enough to recognize the difference between emotional intensity and genuine integrity. The third party's loss of control may have created the confrontation, but your clarity does not need to come from their argument. Your clarity can come from your own standards. You don't need to monitor someone else's relationship. You don't need to decode every silence. You don't need to search for hidden signs in every ordinary event. You need honest communication. If someone wants to be part of your life, let them demonstrate that through responsible choices. If they are married, that fact matters. If they are separated, that should be clearly explained. If their relationship is complicated, they should resolve it themselves rather than making you responsible for the outcome. And if they are uncertain, you do not have to live inside their uncertainty. There is a powerful freedom in realizing that You do not have to chase, you do not have to compete, you do not have to prove that you are better than someone else, you do not have to convince another person to choose you. Healthy connection is not a contest. It is a mutual decision between people who are free to make that decision honestly. So if this message has found you during a confusing season, let it remind you of something simple. You deserve clarity. You deserve respect. You deserve honest communication. You deserve a relationship where you do not constantly wonder whether there is another secret waiting behind the next conversation, and if someone comes toward you carrying a confession, listen carefully. Do not only listen to the beautiful words, listen for accountability, listen for honesty, listen for whether their actions match their explanation. Listen for whether they are taking responsibility for their own choices. That is where the real answer lives, because the biggest secret may not be whether someone has feelings. Feelings are easy to claim. The bigger question is whether someone is mature enough to handle those feelings responsibly. That is what separates fantasy from reality. That is what separates emotional intensity from genuine commitment, and perhaps that is why the argument last night mattered. Not because an argument proves destiny, not because conflict guarantees a reunion, but because conflict can expose what people have been avoiding. When pressure rises, hidden priorities often become visible, and when the truth finally arrives, everyone gets a choice. The third party gets a choice. The person gets a choice. And you get a choice too. That is the part nobody